How's it going, everyone? It's me, Vivi, and welcome back to some Jak and Daxter. So about the massive change of the Jak and Daxter series. The thing about Naughty Dog, it all started with Crash Bandicoot. Then we transitioned to Jak and Daxter. Then we got Uncharted, and then The Last of Us, etc. You already notice a familiar pattern here, like, okay, what is it we can notice? They went from a more colorful, bright game, about exploration and collectathons, to a more dark and gritty style of storytelling. In fact, this sort of transitioning began all the way back when Jak and Daxter was their thing. After Crash Bandicoot, its mass financial and critical hit, they thought of a brand new IP for the PlayStation 2. They called it Jak and Daxter. Basically, they took the exploration aspect of Crash Bandicoot, they expanded upon it, and don't forget the collectathon aspect. It is present in Jak and Daxter. Careful now. We're most definitely looking at their first attempt at the Jak and Daxter series. What I'm referring to is the Precursor Legacy. We went from the whole linear aspect of 3D platformer of Crash Bandicoot to a more style of freedom, like more of freedom of exploration for the player. And Gavin, co-creator, had said that the style and genre of free roaming was something hard to achieve on the PS1. I'm not saying that the programming on PS2 was easy, it did bring a layer of challenge for Naughty Dog. There was an interview with Andy Gavin back in August 2017, let me bring it up. A question was asked, what was the original concept for the game? Was it a deliberate attempt to create a PlayStation 2 mascot to rival Crash Bandicoot? Andy Gavin replied, of course we wanted the franchise to be as big, or bigger, than Crash, and while this didn't quite come to be, it was certainly our goal. Mario 64 back then was trendy. That was certainly a source of inspiration for the free roaming aspect of video games back then. Same goes for the story, like honestly. From Crash Bandicoot to Jak and Daxter, the villains are similar in a way. Two baddies, Gal and Maya, wanting to rule the world with a substance called Dark Eco. Crash Bandicoot, we had an egotistical doctor wanting total world domination. That guy being Dr. Neocortex. Rule the world, multiple colorful levels to explore, nothing too drastic in terms of changes. But then, we got a game called Jak 2, or Jak 2 Renegade, depending on your region. The question is, what happened, and why? As for the what part, well, the tone and feel of the games afterwards were completely radical. We went from a more simplistic level exploring and collecting, not to mention a mute character, I did make a video about that if you're interested, to Jak 2. They transitioned to Renegade, Haven City, guns, vehicles, explosions.
I'm gonna kill Praxis!
The word edgy. And in the end, they made a good choice. And what I mean by this, it's not a personal perspective, but more in terms of business. Despite the major differences between the first and second alterations of Jak and Daxter, they took a big risk, and it paid off. Maybe, just maybe, if it weren't for that risk, Jak and Daxter would have just been titled, quote-unquote, another 3D platformer. A game which wouldn't really stand out from the crowd. Jak 2 received great reception, by the way. Let's not ignore that fact. But there's also one question. Why? Let's not forget about that one. Why the drastic shift in tone? Was it their choice? Was it inspiration? Was it Sony's idea? Was this a case of their audience growing up? Something along those lines. The way this actually happened, we have two key factors for their decision making. One, inspiration, and number two, influence. As for the inspiration part, well, it had to do with Ratchet Clank 1 on the PlayStation 2. Insomniac Games' first Ratchet Clank title, which released back in 2002, whereas Jak and Daxter the Precursor Legacy released back in 2001. As for Jak 2, we're looking at 2003. Insomniac Games and Naughty Dog, by the way, had a very strong closeness while developing their own games. Let's call it friendly rivalry. That's basically what it was back then. Each developer putting themselves up for a challenge. Colin Moriarty, ex-IGN guy, had shared a very interesting story surrounding Insomniac Games. This article was posted back in 2012. In this article, it is explained that Insomniac Games and Naughty Dog, back in the day, were in the same building. This was even before Sony had acquired Naughty Dog. Now, according to Brian Elgire from Insomniac Games, as a result of the two companies sharing the same building, Insomniac and Naughty Dog oftentimes would share a lot of knowledge and, at times, tech. They've almost felt like kind of a family to us, on some level. We used to go to a lot of parties together with them and hang out. Back when Ratchet Clank 1 was available at E3, president of Naughty Dog, today Evan Walls, had played Ratchet Clank 1 and thought it was cool. Moriarty explains that Wells went on to make Jak 2 even more cool after experiencing the original Ratchet & Clank. Now back then, Naughty Dog and Insomniac Games sharing tech with one another, that gave rise to suspicion by fans, thinking that Insomniac Games was perhaps stealing technology from Naughty Dog. No, that's not it. Elgire clarified by saying, the one thing that got miffed about in later years, though, was people would say, oh, Insomniac just took Naughty Dog's engine and repurposed it for Ratchet & Clank. I think a lot of our engine programmers were like, no. We both shared components back and forth. We always wanted to make sure people knew that we developed a lot of the tech. When referring to the tech, people may bring up Goal, Naughty Dog's Andy Gavin's own custom personal engine. Goal is short for Game-Oriented Assembly Lisp, a programming language used for the entirety of the Jak and Daxter saga. According to Ted Price, from Postmortem of Ratchet & Clank, which was shared back in 2003, shortly after we decided to start over, Jason Rubin, Naughty Dog's co-founder, called me and asked if we'd be interested in checking out the technology they developed for Jak and Daxter. He explained that Naughty Dog didn't want anything from us, other than a gentleman's agreement to share with them any improvements we made to whatever we borrowed, plus any of our own technology we felt like sharing. In an industry as competitive as ours, things like this just don't happen. Just the mere Easter eggs alone in both series tells us how close these two developers were back then. Not to mention Spyro and Crash had demos in each of their respective games, developed back in the day. Spyro 1 and 2, developed by Insomniac Games, had Crash demos, for example. Spyro demos in Crash 3 and CTR. With the inspiration aspect out of the way, now comes the influence part. There's a video on YouTube called Season 2 Episode 7 of Devs Play. It's a channel called Double Fine Production. There's an interesting segment, I'm gonna play it. Have a listen.
This Grand Theft Auto 3 thing came out and utterly changed the expectations of the gaming community. We had already started working on Jak 2, and I remember doing a focus group and two 8-year-olds were in this focus group. And I was like, so what do you think? And they acted like 16-year-olds, like 8-year-olds. Well, the graphics are good, and we really like the gameplay. We like what you're doing and the expansion of the universe. Really, this would be a fantastic game for our little brothers. And you're like, you're 8. What are you playing? Grand Theft Auto. If you look, Jak 2 he had a gun. He kind of cursed. Like, he did all the things that we were like trying to grab onto as much of the world as we could.
They mention a focus group being kids. They thought Grand Theft Auto 3 was trendy. Basically going off what Rubin said, GTA was one of the reasons for this sudden change in the Jak and Daxter series. They weren't sure on what to do with Jak and Daxter back then. Sony encouraged them to continue, and they thought the theme of guns and vehicles was trendy. In the end, it all worked out, and they thought it was time to further innovate storytelling by moving on to series such as Uncharted and The Last of Us. Fun fact, Jak and Daxter The Lost Frontier, codenamed Jak PSP back then, was being worked on by Naughty Dog initially. The whole opening cinematic was done by Naughty Dog. However, they had to cancel the project, as to put more focus on Uncharted for the PlayStation 3. They thought 2 games being worked on at the same time was just too much for the team. They deemed Uncharted more important. Plus, it's a game on the PlayStation 3, the next-gen console. According to Josh Scher, from an article written by Colin Moriarty again, shared in 2013, this is what was explained. What happened with the PSP game is that we realized Uncharted would never happen if we still had people working on the PSP game. I'm sure there were some other decisions too, like questioning whether the effort of making the PSP game would be financially worth it to the company, and all that sort of thing. I wasn't privy to those decisions. After High Impact Games dealt with the project, Naughty Dog just knew that it didn't feel right. They were self-aware. According to Sam Thompson, a Sony producer for Jak Daxter back then, at the time, it looked like High Impact Games was going to be able to do a pretty good job with it. I don't want to say anything disparaging. I like the guys at High Impact, but if we had to do it all over again, we would have done some things differently in the execution of The Lost Frontier. I'm not happy with that being Jak's swan song. I think we could have done a lot better. Since Naughty Dog was so heavily focused on their new direction for gaming, heavily narrative stories, dark and gritty, they had thought of making Jak Daxter even more gritty, more realistic than ever before. They were brainstorming at some point. The game was codenamed Jak 4. You can find concept within the art book called The Art of Naughty Dog, which was published back in 2014. After their completion of Jak 2, Sony discussed hardware for the PlayStation 3. They started early brainstorming back then, and they thought, what can we work with? Oh, let's try turning Jak Daxter more realistic. In the end, it didn't work out, because they thought it'd be a disservice to fans, giving a game which is not Jak Daxter. Looking at this, in my personal opinion, it doesn't feel like Jak Daxter to me. So instead of focusing on this, they moved on to The Last of Us. This was explained by creative director of The Last of Us, Neil Druckmann. So with that being said, folks, this is it for the video. If you have any questions, your own thoughts on the stuff I said in the video, feel free to leave everything in the comment section below. And as always, I've been Vivi and thank you so much for watching.